the line barely rang once before she picked up. Her voice was smooth, bright, like a commercial selling calm. I asked how the planning was going, tried to keep it light, made a joke about saving a date before the caterer stole it. There was a pause. I could hear a breath and the faint tap of a keyboard, as if my daughter were answering messages while answering me. Then she said it. We already got married yesterday, just the inner circle. For a second, the room turned thin and far away. The Denver sun was warm on my kitchen tiles, but my hands went cold around the mug. Inner circle. I repeated the words inside my head, slow and bitter, like I was taste testing a lie. I told her I hadn't heard. She said it happened fast. She said it wasn't personal. She said I'd understand. My mouth answered something polite, because 40 years of manners can outmuscle a fresh wound. I told her I was happy for her. I congratulated Tyler. I even managed to ask where they went after, as if this were any other call. I ended the call before my voice showed its cracks. The house went quiet, not the easy kind, the kind that presses against your eardrums until you hear your own pulse. On the shelf, Mark's photo watched me with that steady mechanic's patience. He used to fix things, carburetors, belts, small engines that sputtered until his hands found the real problem. I wanted a wrench for this, something simple and metal and certain. I walked slow through the rooms. The bed was made, the kitchen wiped down, the lists on the corkboard squared and tidy. My life is measured, labeled, color-coded. I'm a retired accountant, my comfort is columns that add up. But nothing about this totaled correctly. I did the mental math anyway. 3 years of deposits to cover Jenna's rent. Grocery transfers. Utilities just until the freelance gigs pick up. The engagement ring photographed under cafe lights, the caption about our season. I remember thinking, that season was paid in installments from your mother's checkbook. The phone rang again in the afternoon. Beth's name flashed on the screen with a little sunflower she once set herself, back when we thought cute things could hold a family together. She sounded giddy and breathless, the way we used to sound when we planned our kids' birthdays, when we still believed effort guaranteed closeness. She said she was ready to hear all about the big day, every last detail. I stared at the window while she talked, watched a delivery truck crawl past like a heavy thought. I heard myself lie. I said it was tiny. I said it was just them. I said it was what they wanted. The words scraped my throat as they came out, dry and hot, like I had swallowed sand. Beth went quiet in that way people do when something doesn't match the picture in their heads. Then she covered the gap with kindness, because that's what good sisters do. She promised to send a card anyway. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was fine. We both knew I wasn't. After I hung up, I washed a plate that didn't need washing. I put it on the rack and lined it up with the others until the symmetry felt like control. The clock on the oven clicked to the next minute. I heard the neighbor's door thump down the hall, the muffled bass of a car passing, my own breath catching as if my chest were learning a new language. There's a particular humiliation in realizing you were edited out of a story you helped fund. It isn't just the event. It's the photograph that will live on without you, smiling faces pretending you were never part of the frame. I kept replaying the phrase, inner circle, until the edges burned. The accountant in me wanted to file it under new policy and move on. The mother in me wanted to ask who taught her to be so good at erasing. I walked to the bedroom. I didn't open the closet. Not yet. The dress I'd chosen months ago waited in the dark like a patient witness. I sat on the edge of the bed instead and pressed my palms to the quilt. The seams made a map under my fingers, little roads of thread leading somewhere I hadn't gone yet. I thought about calling Jenna back and asking why. Not to argue, just to understand the exact coordinates of the border where I became optional. But questions to people who have already closed the door only bruise the knuckles. I made tea. I stood by the window. I let the silence settle where the answers should have been. Would you have kept your voice steady if your only child told you she got married without you, and called it the inner circle? The kettle clicked off. The house held its breath with me. I didn't know it then, but the first boundary of my new life had just started to form, thin as steam, sharp as glass. And the next morning, something in that closet would force me to see it. I lifted the pale blue dress before the sun reached the carpet. The hanger clicked against the rod like a small refusal. I bought it in spring, soft fabric with a gentle waist, something that said proud without shouting. It smelled faintly of dry cleaner and hope. I held it to my chest and felt stupid. On the bed, I laid the dress flat and set the shoebox beside it. Low heels, the kind you can stand in for hours without praying for a chair. Next came the envelope, 15 crisp $100 bills, counted and recounted because order calms me. I had imagined sliding it into Jenna's hand with a joke about old-fashioned gifts. She would laugh. Tyler would promise to use it responsibly. I had pictured their arms around my shoulders, the easy kind of gratitude that doesn't make a person smaller. Now the bills looked like a bribe to keep a seat in a room already closed. I put the envelope back on the duvet and stared at the ceiling fan. It ticked once, like a metronome setting a slower life. My throat went dry the way it does before a hard conversation. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to move. My hands folded the dress along its seams, neat lines that felt like control, and carried it toward the closet. Before I reached the door, my phone buzzed. My body knew before my eyes did. Of course there were photos. I unlocked the screen and there she was, Jenna in satin, sunlight on her shoulder, Tyler's arm firm around her waist. His parents bookending them, faces lifted in the almost prayer of a toast. Restaurant terrace, white strings of lights, the city blurred behind them into a postcard. The caption called it the perfect intimate day with our inner circle. A heat rose from my chest to my cheeks, that particular burn humiliation chooses for its color. I swiped. More photos. The dress was expensive. I recognized the brand from the tag I'd cut off in a store, telling myself a mother should help with a moment like that. The ring caught a ray of sun and bragged about it. There were glasses, plates, a cake that looked like a cloud you could eat. I kept swiping, waiting for a single edge of my life to appear in those squares. Nothing. Not a hand, not a shadow, not a thought of me. Comments poured like confetti, so happy for you, family forever, couldn't be more perfect. I scrolled and felt something harden under my sternum. I noticed a detail that shouldn't matter but did. The table numbers were printed in a font I'd seen on her laptop, one she had chosen while sitting in my kitchen eating a dinner I cooked. She'd practiced her signature monogram on a napkin. I saved that napkin. I don't know why. I set the phone down, then picked it back up and typed, "Congratulations, looks beautiful." The letters wobbled as if the keyboard were a dock on bad water. I stared at the sentence. I erased it. My thumb hovered, then backed the app out to a blank, safer screen. I carried the blue dress to the closet and slid it behind winter coats. The fabric whispered against the wool like a secret escaping. I tucked the shoebox under the bed. The envelope didn't want to leave my hand. Paper has a personality when it's money, it resists being put away when it thinks it has a job. I opened the top drawer of my dresser and slid the bills in beneath the socks like contraband. In the kitchen, I poured water and tried to drink past the knot. The room hummed, the fridge, the distant elevator, a truck braking on the street. Ordinary sounds, unbothered by small disasters. I leaned both palms on the counter and looked at Mark's photo again. He had grease on his sleeve in that picture, smiling at me like a man who liked honest work. If he were here, he'd hand me a rag and say, "Let's see what's actually broken." What was actually broken was simple. My daughter had built a narrative where I didn't exist unless I paid admission. I thought of the nights I waited for her texts, rent late, client delayed, just until next week. I thought of the morning I wired the deposit that kept an eviction notice off her door. I pictured her now, champagne glass tilted toward a camera, a caption about gratitude, and not one mention of the person bankrolling the pretty frame. I opened the phone again, because pain can be a stubborn animal. I found a video. They were laughing, the sound thin in the phone speaker, and his mother adjusted Jenna's veil with practiced hands. I paused it on the ring, watched diamonds catch light that wasn't theirs, and understood something I had been avoiding. I hadn't been helping, I had been auditioning. For acceptance. For access. For the illusion that love requires proof of purchase. If love is welcome, why does it need a password? I turned the phone face down and the glass kissed the table with a soft click. In the drawer, the envelope waited, shut and silent. I felt anger, yes, but underneath it something steadier, a line drawing itself across a map. I didn't know its whole route yet, only that it was moving toward a place where respect wasn't negotiable. The dress slept behind the coats. The cash rested in the dark. I washed my hands like I could rinse the feeling away and dried them on a towel that suddenly looked old. Night folded over the city, and the apartment cooled into a sharper quiet. Somewhere below, a car door slammed. Someone laughed. Life continued, indifferent and steady. I turned off the lights and stood by the window long enough to see my reflection become part of the street. Tomorrow, nothing on my bank schedule would change by itself. But tonight, I let the anger harden just enough to hold a shape. And in that shape, a decision started breathing. 10 days passed like a slow leak. Then my phone lit up before breakfast. Jenna's voice shook the way people shake a vending machine, expecting something to drop. The landlord was threatening to post a notice on the door. The transfer hadn't arrived. Could I fix it today? I let the first reflex rise and pass, like a wave I didn't have to swallow. I pictured myself rushing to the bank, bargaining with my own grocery list, promising my doctor I'd reschedule later. I heard a calm tone come out of my mouth instead. I said I had stopped sending money to people who treated me as optional. The silence that followed felt electric. Accusations started, heartless, dramatic, ungrateful, and I ended the call before those words made a nest. I stood in the hallway until my hands steadied. Then I opened the laptop and the printer coughed awake. Pages slid out, warm and smelling like a new chapter. I lined bank statements across the kitchen table, a paper river of good intentions. Line by line, the numbers told their version. Monthly rent deposits, roughly $600 each, stacked like quiet bricks. Over 3.5 years, they formed a wall I paid for, around $21,000. Groceries and utilities, the soft costs that feel like kindness, about $15,000. Emergencies, a word that multiplies when you fund it, more than $4,500. I added in the smaller drips, the gift cards, the surprise fees. I covered this once. The total settled near $41,100. Mark's savings, translated into everyone else's comfort. I looked up at his photo. He had that grin he saved for stubborn bolts. I whispered that I had spent his legacy trying to buy a respect that never shipped. My voice sounded thin but true. The printer hummed again as if to underline the thought. I filed the statements in a folder labeled with today's date. Across the top I wrote, in small accountant letters, new policy. It felt clinical and honest at once. I made tea and let the steam fog the corner of my glasses. I thought about the word help and how it changes shape when it becomes expected. I thought about the word mother and how it gets misused as a synonym for endless. What does love turn into when it needs a receipt? My phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. I sat at the table and did one more calculation: what dignity costs if you pay in silence. The number is always higher than you think. When the cup was empty, I knew my next task. The autopays lived on their own schedule, they would keep moving unless I moved first. Night crept along the windows like blue ink. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's door thumped shut. I gathered the folder, the courage, and my car keys. Tomorrow, I would cancel every transfer with a pen and a steady hand. I didn't know who would show up after that, with tears, with threats, or with a lawyer. But I knew this: the account they couldn't touch anymore was me. I got to the bank when the morning air still had teeth. The lobby smelled like carpet cleaner and careful decisions. An account manager with perfect bangs looked up my profile, then tilted her head the way people do when they're reading a stranger's diary. She said I'd never missed a transfer. I said that was true, and that it ended today. We went screen by screen. She read the nicknames I'd given the autopays: rent help, utilities bridge, groceries buffer, and her eyebrows did a soft wince. I signed cancellations, one after another, a small ceremony of untying. My hand trembled only on the first line. After that, it learned a new rhythm. She printed confirmations and slid them across like certificates of recovery. When I stepped outside, the light felt cleaner. Leaves scratched along the sidewalk like tiny applause. I stood there longer than anyone needs to stand outside a bank and let the wind rinse the last of my hesitation. The folder in my bag had weight, but for once it didn't feel like obligation. It felt like proof. Driving home, I rehearsed calm responses I hoped I wouldn't need. I promised myself I would not explain my boundaries to people who benefited from not understanding them. I passed the florist where Jenna picked a bouquet last spring and didn't slow down. That was a different chapter. I was riding in a new tense now. 3 unfamiliar cars were huddled near my driveway like a problem meeting. My stomach dropped and then steadied. The front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always lock it. Voices floated from my dining room, the soft murmur people use when they want to sound professional on someone else's turf. They were at my table. Jenna, posture straight and careful. Tyler, leaning back like a man who owned Saturday. And a new face, gray suit, neat smile, a leather folder that had probably never met a grocery list. He rose as if we were old friends. He introduced himself as Attorney Royce. His handshake was confident in the way of a hand that signs for other people's things. Jenna said they were worried. Tyler nodded like a supportive infomercial husband. Royce slid a packet toward me with tabs in cheerful colors. He called it a temporary arrangement to help me manage the complexities while protecting my long-term security. He'd already filled in my name and birthdate, which felt both efficient and obscene. The words "durable power of attorney" showed up halfway down the page like a quiet trap. I didn't sit. I opened the packet, not to read it, but to feel the paper. It was heavy, the kind that tries to impress a judge. There were signature flags everywhere, little neon arrows pointing at my freedom. My name repeated across the pages, surrounded by phrases that turned my life into an asset portfolio. He explained how it would work. They would take care of bills, investments, healthcare decisions if needed. I heard the word "if" and pictured it erasing the rest of the sentence. I walked to the kitchen trash can, opened the lid, and let the packet fall. The sound was soft, but it landed like a verdict. I said the only move happening today was theirs, out the front door. My voice surprised me. It was steady, almost polite, like a teacher dismissing a class that had run long. Jenna blinked first. She said I was being dramatic. Tyler tried a different tack, concern seasoned with authority. He said money can be confusing at my age. He said I'd been missing payments. He said the landlord called him about my rent, which made no sense because this is my house. Roy stepped in with a practiced calm. He said families often resist help at the beginning, and that a short-term delegation could prevent larger interventions. He let the word intervention hang like a storm cloud. I reached into my bag and laid the bank's cancellation confirmations on the table. Paper can be louder than voices when it's the right paper. I told them the transfers were over, effective today, and that any conversation about my finances would now run through a lawyer, mine, not theirs. I didn't say Daniel's name yet. I wanted them to feel the outline without seeing the details. Jenna's mouth tightened. She said they had already consulted someone to protect me from myself. Tyler added that mistakes had been made, me forgetting appointments, me confusing bills, me isolating. It was like listening to a radio tuned to a station I didn't authorize. I asked which bills. Silence. I asked which appointments. More silence. Royce finally spoke the truth they had been circling. He said if I wouldn't sign, there were other legal paths to ensure my assets were appropriately stewarded. A small laugh escaped me. Not the happy kind. The kind that comes out when horror tries to wear logic's face. I told them to leave. I said it once in a voice you use for a toddler near a hot stove. Then I said it again with the weight Mark used when a wrench slipped and he decided the bolt would yield or break. Royce gathered his briefcase with a sigh that sounded like billable time. Tyler pushed back his chair too hard and didn't apologize. Jenna lingered, eyes shiny, and asked if I wanted to be alone forever. What kind of love asks that at a dining table it broke into? They crossed the threshold and the house exhaled. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt, the metallic click a small anthem. My hands shook after. I sat and felt each tremor like a message from my body saying, yes, this matters. I made a list because lists steady me: call Daniel Collins, scan documents, change the door code, install a doorbell camera. The order calmed my breath. In the trash, a tab with my name showed above a used paper towel like a flag in the wrong country. I pressed the pedal and tucked it deeper. I washed my hands though nothing sticky had touched them. The water ran hot, a clean pain. When I turned off the tap, the house was so quiet I could hear the clock count the seconds I had just reclaimed. On the counter, the bank folder waited like a patient witness. Outside, the cars idled, then scattered. I imagined a flurry of texts, new plans forming on screens I didn't own. My phone buzzed once and went still. I didn't check it. I stood by the window until the glass cooled my forehead and thought of Mark's old proverb: if a tool keeps hurting you, it's not the right tool. Family is not a tool. Dusk slid across the floor like a curtain closing on Act 1. I locked the back door, checked the windows, and wrote Daniel's number at the top of a fresh page. I didn't know who would knock next, or what badge they would carry, or what title they would use to name their concern. But I had a feeling the next visitor wouldn't be family, and that was the point where this stopped being private. The doorbell rang with a measured chime, the kind that tries to sound polite. Through the peephole, a woman stood with a city badge and calm shoulders. She introduced herself as Carlin Gwynn from the Office of Adult Protection. Her tone was careful, trained to soothe. There had been reports, she said, about concerns with my decision-making. Could she come in? For a second, shame reached for my throat. Then something steadier grabbed its wrist. I opened the door. I kept my voice even. I told her I would be glad to answer questions. While she stepped inside, I scrolled to a number a friend had pressed into my hand last month: Daniel Collins, elder law attorney. I called him and gave him the short version. He said he could be there in 20 minutes. I heard typing in the background like an engine already turning over. Carla moved like a person who has seen both truth and performance. She asked if we could sit at the dining table. I offered water I didn't drink. She opened a slim folder and placed a pen across the top, a tiny bridge between us. She began with ordinary questions: daily routine, medication management, how I handle bills. I answered in the rhythm I use for tax season: clear, complete, nothing extra. Daniel arrived with a leather brief and a suit that didn't apologize. He introduced himself, shook Carla's hand, and took the chair at my left like he'd sat there for years. He didn't posture. He didn't crowd. He asked, gently, what the nature of the report was. Carla said the allegations included confusion, missed payments, isolation, and vulnerability to exploitation. The word exploitation made the air colder. We laid out my life in paper. Utility bills with zero balances. Property tax receipts stamped paid. Insurance statements filed by date. Pharmacy printouts showing refills on schedule. The bank's online dashboard glowed from my laptop, every due date green. Daniel slid his reading glasses down and organized the stack without fuss, like a medic triaging a patient who isn't bleeding. While we worked, Carla looked around the room the way professionals do, at plants that weren't dying, at a calendar with appointments checked off, at a floor that remembered a vacuum. She asked who helped me with finances. I said no one. She asked about family. I gave her the honest nouns: daughter, son-in-law, distance. I did not offer opinions. The facts were enough. I told her about canceling the transfers yesterday, about the surprise visit with an attorney and papers I dropped in the trash. Carla took that in without blinking. Her pen moved, a steady scratch like rain on a window. She asked if I felt safe. I heard my own answer before I thought it through. I said I felt safer today than I did last month. Daniel asked permission to share context. Carla nodded. He outlined the pattern he'd seen too often: adult children normalized to a parent's money, a boundary finally set, then a sudden flood of concern framed as protection. He said my documentation was strong and my presentation consistent. He suggested a cognitive and financial capacity evaluation to close the loop. He said the goal wasn't to pass a test, it was to end a story that never should have started. Carla asked me to walk her through how I pay bills online. I showed her the routine: two-factor authentication, recurring reminders, the little checkmarks I click because I like checkmarks. She asked how I track spending. I brought out a spreadsheet with neat columns and a tab labeled annual. She smiled at that, not to flatter me, just in recognition. She asked me to name my medications and doses. I did, slow and accurate. She asked about the last time I got lost in a familiar place. I told her never. She asked the date and day and where we were. I answered like a schoolgirl who still likes quizzes. When she closed her folder, it sounded like a soft verdict. She said she saw no sign I was unable to care for myself. She said her report would reflect that. She said a formal capacity evaluation could add weight if anything proceeded to court. Court. The word clanged in my ribs, but it also aligned the pieces on the table. If this was a campaign, I needed a strategy, not apologies. Would you call it care if the first step is calling the state? Carla stood to leave. At the door, she paused. She chose her words like someone stepping across stones in a stream. She said she'd worked many cases where concern and control wore matching outfits. She didn't tell me what to think. She didn't need to. The house felt different after she left, lighter in the corners, heavier in the center where the folder sat. Daniel waited until the latch clicked. Then he turned to me with a quiet look I understood from Mark's shop, the look men used when a small noise warned of a larger failure. He said we should expect a formal legal move, a conservatorship petition. He had already called a neuropsychologist he trusted, Dr. Elaine Sue, neutral and thorough. He recommended we schedule an evaluation immediately, not as a performance, but as evidence. He asked for a list of people who could speak to my routine and competence, not relatives if possible. I gave him Ruth's name without hesitation, and the pharmacist's, and my primary doctor. He outlined next steps in clean lines. We would gather statements. We would memorialize the cancelled transfers. We would print the bank records we had organized. He would prepare to answer every claim before it was made. His voice stayed even, but the subtext was steel: we were not waiting to be defined. I walked him to the door and felt the rug under my feet like ground that finally agreed with me. On the counter, the glass of water I'd poured for Carla sat half full, the surface smooth and undisturbed. I picked it up and drank until it clicked empty. The taste was plain and perfect. The house settled. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's laugh drifted through the wall, quick and harmless. I gathered the paperwork into the folder with today's date and slid a new tab behind it labeled capacity. The labeler in me found comfort in that small tyranny over chaos. What happens when people who mistake access for love meet a boundary that doesn't blink? I turned off the dining room light and watched the room exhale into shade. Somewhere beyond my window, a plan I didn't write was already forming. Daniel would call tomorrow with an appointment time. Carla would file her report. And Jenna would not be finished. I locked the door and felt the bolt slide home, a quiet line between their story and mine. The certified letter hit the mat like a small gavel. I knew before I bent to pick it up. The return address wore the county's crest, the window showed my name printed in a font that thinks it owns you. In the kitchen, I slit it open with a butter knife because that's the blade I had. The title read, "In the matter of Linda Carver, proposed protected person." My stomach went cold. Pages slid out, petition, exhibits, declarations. They said I was confused about money. They said I missed payments. They said I was isolating, vulnerable, declining. Someone had highlighted phrases in yellow as if my life were a study guide. A neighbor's sworn statement followed, Mr. Klein complaining about unusual visitors and odd hours, which I recognized as code for my friends having key lime pie on the patio at 9. Then Mr. Patel's name appeared under a typed line that said he was concerned, his signature awkward and slanted like it had been hurried at a counter. I imagined a courtroom with a judge who didn't know me, a clerk who would pronounce my name without looking up, my daughter with wet eyes telling a story that made her the hero. For one long breath, fear tried to take the driver's seat. Then I moved it to the back. I called Daniel. I didn't bother with politeness. He answered on the first ring, and I heard his keyboard wake up in the background. He said, "We expected this," not unkind, but like a surgeon confirming the diagnosis we already saw on the scan. He told me to bring everything. 10 minutes later, my folder and I were in his office under recessed lights that made every table look like a witness stand. He read fast, eyes steady. He made a short sound at Mr. Klein's paragraph, the kind of sound you make when a bolt is stripped. He flagged Mr. Patel's statement with a blue tab. He underlined the phrase, temporary orders if exigent. He said we would move faster. He said we would not chase their story, we would write ours in documents. By the time I left, the plan had corners. First, a comprehensive cognitive and financial capacity evaluation with a neutral specialist, Dr. Elaine Sue. Second, statements from people who actually know my routines. Not family. People with no reason to lie. Third, assemble financial records in a way that even a tired clerk could follow, zero balance bills, on-time payments, account summaries, tax returns, the cancelled transfers. Fourth, document my home setup, medication list, calendar, grocery system, the labeled folders that have kept my life upright since the 80s. Fifth, no direct contact with Jenna or Tyler until the hearing. All communication through counsel. Paper only. Daniel's assistant handed me an appointment card for Dr. Sue, 2 mornings from now, 9 a.m., bring your glasses, she said with a kind smile. And breakfast. They run you through a lot. That night I slept like a person guarding a gate. I woke before the alarm, wrote questions to outrun the ache, and walked circles in the living room until the sun unrolled across the floor. I installed the new smart lock and synced the doorbell camera, the app pinging like a tiny guard dog. I labeled a fresh binder capacity and slid blank tabs into the rings, the tidy snap oddly comforting. Control is a habit. Today, it was also a strategy. Dr. Sue's office smelled like lemon and paper. She shook my hand the way professionals do, warm, exact, unhurried. She explained that her role was neutral. She didn't work for me, or for Jenna, or for the court. She worked for the truth. She said it kindly, but the word landed like a coin on a table. We began. She asked me to list the months backward. I did, my voice steady until I tripped over July and corrected myself. She had me remember 5 words and repeat them later: apple, lamp, river, velvet, 12. I pictured them in a row like items on my shelf. She set a clock face in front of me and asked me to draw a time. I drew it, numbers spaced clean, hands firm. She gave me a bank statement with a wrong charge hidden inside and asked how I would dispute it. I walked her through it step by step, including the hold music and the reference number I'd write down. She smiled, not in approval, just in recognition. We moved on. She asked me to explain interest, to balance a checkbook line, to decide what to do if someone called asking for my social security number. My answers pulled from the same commonplace tax season used to. Midway through, she slid over a page of scenarios, medical choices, emergencies, the what-ifs that life always thinks are surprises. I didn't perform. I described my real habits: list, plan, verify, act. Between sections, she watched how I watched her. That's part of the test too, I think, the attention behind the answers. She asked about my day, when I wake, what I eat, how I remember pills. She asked who I see, where I go, what brings me joy. I told her about the Tuesday market with Ruth, about the cafe where the barista knows my order, about the travel folder I keep in my desk labeled Someday, and how someday has been inching closer. At the end, she gathered the pages and folded her hands. She didn't make a speech. She didn't break character. She said she would write a full report and send it to the court and to my attorney. She said, as a human being and not an evaluator, that my performance did not concern her. She said many people a decade younger don't track details as well as I do. I walked out lighter than I walked in. In the elevator, a man in a baseball cap hummed to himself and I wanted to hum too. The city felt crisp and square, like someone had ironed the skyline. Back home, the mailbox held another envelope, hearing notice. 3 weeks away. Courtroom 4B. Probate Division. Judge Miguel Ramirez. The time was 9:30 a.m., a number that looked clean and brutal on the page. I pinned it to the corkboard and drew a box around it. Underneath, I wrote prep in block letters, then smaller, Ruth, primary doctor, Carla's card, receipts, pharmacy log, doorbell clips. I didn't know whether the clips would matter, I only knew that, lately, people entered my home without asking and called it care. That afternoon, Daniel emailed a draft witness list. Ruth agreed within minutes, her reply all caps and 3 exclamation points because she writes like she bakes, generous, unafraid. My doctor promised a short statement. Carla couldn't testify for me, but her report could be requested. Daniel also asked for the pharmacist's number. He wanted to find out how Jenna had obtained that signature. When I walked to the drugstore at dusk, Mr. Patel looked surprised to see me. He seemed even more surprised when I mentioned the statement. His eyes darted, then softened. He asked if we could talk tomorrow, when the rush ended. I said yes. I sat at the table that night with 2 stacks, what they said, what was true. The difference between those piles was the difference between theft and help. I thought of Mark's hands, how he could feel a failing part by touch alone. I held the petition between my fingers until the paper warmed. Then I slid it into a clear sleeve labeled them, and my own documents into a sleeve labeled me. It was petty and it helped. If dignity needs a judge, is it still yours? The doorbell camera pinged once and showed a cat skirting the steps. I laughed, the sound unfamiliar in my throat lately, and let it sit there a moment. Then I checked the calendar and began rehearsing answers out loud. Names, dates, amounts. Not to perform. To remember who owns my story when the microphones are cold and the room smells like wood polish. 3 weeks isn't long. It's also forever. On the night before the appointment with Mr. Patel, I took the hearing notice down and traced the judge's name with my finger like a prayer or a dare. The house was quiet, the kind that no longer pressed against my ears. My binder spine clicked shut. Courtroom 4B waited. And so did I, not meek, not loud, ready. Ruth knocked like a friend who already knew the answer. She held a foil-covered pan that smelled like butter and brown sugar, set it on my counter, and listened without fidgeting while I laid out the pieces. She didn't interrupt with advice. She just said, plain as a porch light, that she would come to court and tell the truth. The steadiness in her voice did more for my breathing than tea or prayer. We made coffee. We cut bars into even squares. Sugar, cinnamon, calm. For a moment the kitchen felt like a small country that still believed in neighbors. She asked what I needed. I told her a ride the morning of the hearing would help. She said she'd be there at 8 with quiet radio and mints. When she left, the apartment still held her warmth like a coat I hadn't taken off. Hearing day arrived with a sky the color of a decision. I dressed like an accountant on purpose, navy jacket, clean lines, shoes that kept me grounded. I pinned Mark's small wrench tie pin inside my lapel where only I could feel it. Ruth pulled up right on time and drove with the kind of silence that isn't empty, it's respectful. My hand shook in my lap once, then again, then less. The courthouse air smelled like wood polish and the heavy paper of forms. Collins met us outside 4B, tie neat, eyes alert. He placed a hand on the back of the bench near me, not touching, just anchoring. "We do this as planned," he said softly. "No performances. Only facts." His tone made the hallway stop spinning. Inside, the courtroom looked like a church that had given up on forgiving. Dark wood. A flag that didn't blink. The court reporter poised with her machine like a pianist waiting for the first note. Judge Ramirez entered with a walk that said he'd seen worse and better and would measure this against both. The clerk called the case. My name echoed in a room that swallowed echoes. Jenna and Tyler slid in on the other side, dressed in tasteful sorrow. They didn't look at me, the way people avoid mirrors on bad mornings. An older couple I assumed were his parents sat behind them, hands clasped like they were praying for a car loan. Attorney Royce had traded yesterday's leather folder for a binder with tabs that tried to look friendly. He whispered to Jenna, and she nodded as if agreeing with a script. We all stood. We all sat. A rhythm older than family played itself out. Royce spoke first, low and sympathetic, painting a portrait of decline. He said the words I expected: confusion, isolation, vulnerability. He pronounced financial exploitation with solemn care, as if naming a dragon he intended to slay. He described himself as a shield. The story sounded practiced, and why wouldn't it? He practiced this story for a living. Then Jenna took the stand. The oath sounded brittle coming out of her mouth. She held a tissue like a prop. She told the judge that I had become difficult and erratic, that I refused help, that bills were slipping and neighbors were worried. She said that when children step up, parents sometimes push them away out of fear. It was a tidy narrative, full of soft edges that cut anyway. Every few sentences, she glanced at Tyler as if borrowing belief. He offered the nods on cue. She mentioned installing a smart lock as evidence I was paranoid. She framed the cancelled transfers as proof of instability, not a boundary. I watched the story lift itself on rehearsed wings and reminded myself not to chase it. Would you recognize love if it came at you dressed like a rescue? Collins didn't rush to his feet. He rose like a man who had decided not to waste motion. He asked for permission to cross, voice even. He didn't attack. He arranged questions like chess pieces and waited for them to do their work. He began with time. When was the last call Jenna made to me that didn't reference money? Dates, please. Not around, not recently. Actual dates. She blinked. She looked at Royce. She guessed and guessed wrong. He pressed, gently, inexorably, until the silence turned from theatrical to revealing. He moved to the wedding. Was it true there was a celebration with her husband's family? Were there photographs? Did she invite me? He let the questions breathe, then asked whether years of support from me had helped fund wedding-related expenses, deposits, dresses, rings, yes or no. The tissue paused halfway to her eye. She said it was complicated. He said the court preferred simple. A small sound rippled through the gallery: breath, chair leg, conscience. Judge Ramirez leaned back, face unreadable, the way good judges shelter their thoughts. Collins asked about the transfers. He put the amounts on a screen without drama: rent deposits, utilities, groceries, emergencies. He asked Jenna to confirm the totals. She didn't. He showed the confirmations from the bank: auto pays cancelled yesterday, clean and official. He asked if her petition had been filed before or after those cancellations. She stared at the page as if it would forgive her. Tyler shifted in his seat, energy sharpening like a knife being tested on paper. Collins noticed without looking. He pivoted to concern. He asked Jenna to list a single unpaid bill of mine, a single late fee, a single notice. She couldn't. He asked whether she'd been present when a caseworker from the city reviewed my home. She hadn't. He asked if she'd read the report. She hadn't, because it wasn't in their file. He let the absence speak. Then Collins did the thing that tightened every rib in my chest. He asked Jenna to explain, for the court's clarity, what she meant by inner circle. He didn't add heat. He didn't need to. He asked who qualified for the circle at her wedding, and whether the person who covered her rent for 3 years qualified. He left the sentence open like a door she couldn't close without walking through the truth. The room held still in that heavy way rooms do when the next word matters. I could hear the court reporter's keys, Ruth's breath, the soft tick of the clock above the seal. My own heartbeat felt like it had taken a seat at counsel table. Jenna swallowed. She offered a phrase about keeping things small. Collins nodded, as if she'd confirmed a weather report. He asked no further question. He let the phrase hover, exposed by its own lack of weight. He sat. Roy stood again, tried to sand the edges, to repaint the story. But paint doesn't hold on wet surfaces, and something in the room had just dried. I watched Judge Ramirez make a note with deliberate strokes. The scratch of his pen sounded like a verdict warming up its voice. When the judge called a short recess, I realized my jaw had been clenched so tight my gums ached. Ruth touched the back of my arm with 2 fingers, the contact was small, the effect large. Collins leaned in and spoke low enough that only I heard. He said Tyler would be next, and that sometimes brittle stories crack fastest under their own weight. What breaks easier, lies, or the silence that stops feeding them? The clerk announced 5 minutes. The officers shifted. The room breathed. I smoothed my jacket, felt the cold circle of Mark's hidden pin, and sat straighter. Across the aisle, Tyler adjusted his tie and smiled at nothing. Then the bailiff called us back, and Collins stood to meet the next witness. The microphone caught Tyler's breath before it caught his words. He adjusted the chair, smoothed his tie, and called me paranoid. He said the smart lock and doorbell camera were overreactions, signs I was slipping. He painted himself as the calm son-in-law, simply trying to keep me safe. Collins stood like a man closing a cabinet that had been left open. He asked when Tyler first entered my house with Attorney Royce. Was I home? Was I asked? Tyler said the door wasn't latched. Collins asked if the word for entering an occupied dwelling without permission was help. Tyler's smile didn't reach his eyes. Collins held up a still from my doorbell camera, the timestamp the day after that visit. He asked if installing basic security after an uninvited meeting qualified as paranoia, or as learning. Would you call a lock dangerous because it refuses a stranger? Next came Mr. Patel. He looked apologetic before he spoke, hands folded like he was counting pills. Royce asked him to confirm concern about my memory. Mr. Patel hesitated. He said Jenna had brought in a paper, rushed and flustered, and asked him to sign a character note. He admitted he didn't read it carefully. He said he had never seen me confused at the counter and had never, not once, worried about my ability to manage medications. His voice got firmer as he went. If my signature suggests otherwise, he said, that wasn't my intent. Collins nodded, marking the moment like a bookmark. Mr. Klein was next, tight-mouthed and pleased to be important. He complained about unusual visitors, about my friends laughing on the patio, about a car that idled too long near his hydrangeas. Collins asked how long he had lived next door. 12 years. Collins asked whether he had ever seen an unpaid notice on my door. No. Whether he had ever seen the police at my home. No. Whether he had ever spoken to me about any concern before the petition. Also no. Then Collins asked if he had filed a complaint last summer about Ruth parking partly over the line. Mr. Klein reddened and said that wasn't relevant. The judge made a small note without looking up. Ruth took the stand like a lighthouse, steady, unafraid of weather. She described Tuesdays at the market, the way I double-check prices and remember the vendors' names. She mentioned the 2-factor codes on my phone, the calendar on my wall with each bill checked off. She said I had taught her how to avoid scams by making callers verify themselves. She didn't gush. She was precise. When she finished, she turned toward me for a half second, and I felt my spine lift. Collins called me last. I stood, placed my hand where everyone places their hand, and promised the truth. The oath felt heavier than it sounds on television. I sat and folded my fingers to keep them from performing my nerves. We started where accountants start, numbers. Collins put the summary slide up without heat. Monthly rent deposits, roughly $600, for about 3.5 years. Total near $21,000. Groceries and utilities over the same span, around $15,000. Emergencies, more than $4,500. The grand total hovered at approximately $41,100. He asked where that money came from. I said plainly, Mark's savings. He asked if anyone coerced me into sending it. I said no. He asked why I stopped. I said, because respect is not a subscription, and I was done paying for access to my own child. He let that sit, then asked about the wedding. I described learning about it on the phone and then online, photos of Jenna with Tyler and his parents under cafe lights. The caption used the phrase inner circle. I told the court I had bought a dress, set aside a cash gift, and realized I had been edited out of a story I funded. My voice shook once. I let it. I didn't decorate it. Collins moved to the house visit. I explained returning home to find them at my table with Attorney Royce, papers marked with cheerful tabs for signatures that would have handed over my life. I described dropping the packet into the trash and instructing them to leave. I said I installed the lock and camera the next day because that is what safety looks like when people confuse your home with a lobby. We addressed the practicals. I described my bill-paying routine, the green check marks, the drawers labeled tax, medical, home. Collins asked how I remember medications. I said the dosette tray is filled every Sunday, and my phone alarm is set for 8 o'clock and 8 o'clock, a.m. and p.m. He asked if I ever missed property tax. No. He asked if I've ever had utilities shut off. No. He asked if a caseworker visited me last week. Yes. He asked what she concluded. That I am able to care for myself. He introduced Dr. Sue's report as an exhibit. The judge flipped through, eyes moving, pen still. Collins summarized, briefly, cognitive testing within normal limits, financial decision-making intact, no evidence of dementia or impairment. He didn't read a line more than necessary. He trusted the paper to do the speaking. Royce rose for cross. He tried to make my cancellations sound impulsive. I explained the dates. He tried to suggest bitterness guided my choices. I said boundaries often look like bitterness to people who preferred you without them. He pointed to the doorbell clips as proof that I was fixated on security. I said, I like my home to be mine. He asked if I loved my daughter. The question was meant to bend me. I said yes, without a pause. He asked if love sometimes requires sacrifice. I said it does. He asked if I regretted helping. I said I regretted not saying no sooner, because real help doesn't hide a bill in the fine print. The courtroom got very quiet in that way rooms do when the truth finally takes a full breath. Collins had one last question. He asked what I wanted from the court. I said, to be allowed to keep living as the person I've always been, and to spend Mark's legacy on what he and I believed in, not on proving I deserve a seat at my daughter's table. I stepped down and felt my knees remember how to bend. Ruth's eyes were wet. Daniel squeezed his pen and not my hand, which fit us both. Across the aisle, Jenna stared at the table like it might open. Judge Ramirez leaned forward, elbows on the bench, his glasses low on his nose. He said we would take a short recess. He wanted to review Dr. Sue's report again and the exhibits just admitted. His tone was neutral, his posture was not. We stood. The clock clicked. The bailiff called 15 minutes. Outside, the hallway felt colder, and my chest felt lighter. I pressed my palm against the small wrench pin inside my jacket and breathed the slow, counted breaths they teach you after surgery. What would a verdict sound like if it handed you your life back? The clerk's voice floated from 4B, calling us in. I crossed the threshold, took my seat, and faced the bench as the judge lifted his notes. Judge Ramirez adjusted his glasses and looked over the rim like a man weighing metal. He turned one more page of Dr. Sue's report, then set it down. The room drew a single breath and held it. Based on the evaluation and testimony, he said, the court finds Ms. Carver fully capable of managing her personal and financial affairs. What I see here is not incapacity, but relatives attempting to gain control of her assets. Petition denied. The words didn't explode. They landed, solid and careful, like a key finding its lock. My shoulders dropped a fraction I hadn't realized they were holding. Collins nodded once, approval without theatrics. Ruth's hands rose to her mouth and then fell to her lap as if she were praying and exhaling at the same time. What do you call freedom when a judge hands it back to you? The gavel tapped. Paper shuffled. The court reporter paused, then cleared her machine for the next case, as if lives didn't just turn on this wood table. Jenna stood without looking at me. Tyler whispered to Royce, the two of them already rebuilding a narrative from scraps on the floor. As we passed in the aisle, Jenna leaned close enough that her perfume reached me before her words. You'll regret this, she murmured. You'll die alone. I inhaled, held, released. I'd rather live alone with self-respect, I said quietly, than be surrounded by people who treat me like an ATM. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Some sentences carry their own volume. In the corridor, light from the high windows fell in clean rectangles. Collins joined me at the bench, set his binder down, and gave me the look mechanics give an engine that just caught. Congratulations, he said. Now let's make the victory stick. He suggested we meet that afternoon to revise my estate plan. No drama, just the next right page. If you want, he added, we can direct your legacy towards something that would make the past few months mean more than pain. I thought of Mark's hands, steady and stained with work, and the way he hated waste, of time, of parts, of dignity. Yes, I said. Let's make it count. Outside, Denver's air felt thinner, like a room after someone opens a window. Ruth wrapped me in a hug that didn't press or plead, it simply held. She asked if I wanted lunch. I said let's take a picture instead, just for us. No performance. Proof. We stood by the courthouse steps, two women with wind in their hair, and smiled the kind of smile that knows exactly what it cost to exist. Collins's office was all glass and order. He slid a yellow pad across the table and let me speak first. I told him about the nonprofits I'd read about, the ones that help older adults fight scams, the clinics that teach families the difference between support and control, the community kitchens that feed people without asking for proof of worth. He listened, wrote, asked precise questions. Did I want percentages or caps? Did I want a letter with the will that explains my choices? Did I want to bar Jenna and Tyler from serving in any fiduciary role? Yes, absolutely. We called his paralegal in. Drafts appeared on a screen like blueprints for a house I could finally live in. A no contest clause. A charitable trust with clear instructions. A durable power of attorney naming Daniel's colleague as a backup, just in case life took an unkind turn later. We added a quiet gift to the market Ruth and I loved, yearly sponsorship for the senior voucher program, so others could point to tomatoes and say yes without counting quarters. When the documents were ready, he read them aloud in the even tone that had carried me from fear to fact. I initialed where flags asked, signed where lines waited, and watched my name become the boundary it should have always been. Collins notarized each page, his stamp a small funder. He slid copies into a folder and placed it in my hands like a promise. Mark would approve, he said, not as flattery but as recognition. I felt the wrench pin against my lapel and nodded. Evening found its way in through my kitchen window, warm and the color of relief. Ruth knocked twice and entered with soup and a half bottle of wine. Behind her came two more neighbors I knew by first name and kindness, each carrying something small and good. They didn't ask for the play-by-play. They didn't ask to see the order. They set bowls, poured glasses, and let joy be quiet. We toasted, first to truth, then to boundaries, then to the families we build when the ones we're born into forget how to be gentle. The wine tasted like apples and second chances. The soup was chicken and lemon, bright enough to cut whatever the day had left behind. Someone made a joke about Mr. Klein's hydrangeas, and the laughter that followed didn't feel defiant. It felt clean. I told them, in pieces, what the judge said, what Jenna whispered, what I answered. Ruth's eyes flashed, then softened. "You didn't lose a daughter today," she said. "You stopped losing yourself." After they left, the apartment settled into a calm I recognized from the years before begging became a ritual. I stacked bowls in the sink with a care that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with gratitude. On the table, the folder from Collins lay where the courthouse air had set it down. I touched the cover with my fingertips, not as ownership, but as thanks. I opened my phone and drafted a message to Beth. I told the truth this time, plain and complete. I apologized for the lie, then sent her the one photo Ruth and I took on the courthouse steps. She replied with a flood of hearts and a promise to visit soon. I believed her. Not because she owed me, but because she knew how to show up without a receipt. The night thinned to quiet. I stood at the window and watched the city move like a living map, tail lights threading, people crossing, a cyclist chasing a green light. Somewhere out there, Jenna was rewriting her version. Somewhere in here, I was writing the next chapter of mine. What will you build when the story stops demanding you pay to belong? I turned off the lamp. The room held its shape in the dark. Tomorrow I would clean the closet, list the old house, and put Sunday trips on a real calendar. But before any of that, I stood very still and let the new will's weight teach my hands that they were mine. The realtor's pen clicked and the old house became a past tense. Key slid across the table, light as coins and heavy as years. I drove to my new apartment with the windows cracked, autumn riding in on the smell of bread from a corner bakery. The plaza below looked like a small city practicing how to be kind, kids with scooters, a violinist, a dog that believed everyone loved him. Boxes stacked like new possibilities. I learned the rhythm of the building, trash chute sighs, elevator dings, and neighbors' laughs spilling under the door. Morning meant coffee over the plaza and a walk through light. Evening meant the balcony and the kind of quiet that doesn't accuse you of anything. Work found me the way right things do, through a flyer, a friend, a need that matched what I had. I joined a volunteer program that taught older adults how to protect themselves from scams and pressure dressed as love. We met in a library basement that smelled like paper and hope. I talked about caller ID, two-factor codes, and the power of saying no like it was a complete sentence. I kept my story trimmed, just the bones, enough to build recognition without opening old wounds. Heads nodded. Pens scratched. Someone always asked afterward, in a soft voice, how to rebuild trust with a child. How many of us mistake generosity for proof that we are worth keeping? I watched people practice scripts. Let me think about it, send that in writing, no, not this time. The first no always sounded shaky. The second sounded like progress. The third sounded like a person arriving. I traveled because I could. Florence was a dome against blue that wouldn't quit, and I sketched it with a pencil that kept breaking from pressing too hard. I ate gelato on a church step and let sweetness argue with grief, and sweetness won by a scoop. New Orleans was brass and sunlight and a street band that turned strangers into cousins. I danced like a woman who had traded grace for honesty, arms a little too wide, smile a little too real. I sent Ruth a photo of beignet and powdered sugar on my jacket. She replied with a laughing face and a warning about my dry cleaner. Mark came with me the way memory travels, quiet, patient, good with maps. Sometimes I touched the wrench pin inside my jacket and told him small updates. We won, I'm okay, you were right about bolts and people. I felt him in the choices that didn't look big until they added up to a life. Months stacked, gentler than before. On a Tuesday, the program director read a thank you note from a woman who had stopped a nephew from borrowing her checking account. She wrote that she slept for the first time in weeks. We passed the card hand to hand like communion. I let my thumb rest on the ink a little longer. That night on the balcony, the city was a necklace of patient lights. Air moved across my arms like water finding its level. My phone buzzed against the table, screen lighting my glass. A message from Jenna, "Mom, we need to talk." The words pushed and pulled at once. My heart did the old reflex and then remembered the new rule. I turned the phone over, felt the cool weight in my palm, and typed slowly, "The way you write truth so it doesn't wobble." I said any conversation would have to start with an apology, not a request for money. I set the phone face down and let the moment pass through me instead of over me. Across the plaza, a couple argued in a language I didn't know and then laughed at themselves. A bus sighed. Somewhere, a trumpet practiced the same bar until it learned how to say what it meant. I lifted my glass and let the city reflect in it like a promise kept. I once believed love had a running tab, that the bill would arrive with proof I was chosen. Now I know the balance was never mine to carry. Real love doesn't invoice. Real love shows up without a receipt. I sat until the air thinned and the stars felt closer than names. I thought about the classroom in the basement, about Ruth's steady hands, about the judge's voice, about Mark's patient nod. I thought about the blue dress sleeping behind a coat in some thrift store now, waiting to be useful to someone who never met me. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't flinch. I let it ring out into an apartment that knew the shape of my breath. Tomorrow, maybe, a different message. Maybe not. Either way, I was already whole. I didn't win her back. I won myself.